Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Meer, and welcome to the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK here in Cardiff.
Thank you for having me.
You're here tonight to talk about Islamophobia. Could you briefly summarise what you're going to be talking about this evening?
Yes, I'm going to be talking about how journalists themselves understand the idea of Islamophobia and how they use that idea in their reporting of stories on Muslims in Britain, and how that compares with how they report stories about Jewish minorities and other ethnic and racial minorities.
You're currently a research fellow at Bristol University. Could you tell us what research you're working on at the moment?
Yes, of course. One of the main projects I'm working on is a 9-country comparison of citizenship programmes in Europe. And it's a European Commission-funded study, and what we're interested in is comparing how newer European countries that have joined through EU accession, such as Latvia and Poland and Estonia, how they compare to older European countries like France and Britain and Germany.
Do you think Islamophobia is an adequate term to describe anti-Muslim prejudice?
I think Islamophobia is a relatively new term in the social and political landscape. As such, it's a term that needs to be built upon and developed to capture several dynamics of anti-Muslim prejudice. I think, as it stands, it needs some work, but rather than attack it or critique it, we should develop it.
The media are often blamed for perpetuating negative stereotypes of Muslims. What do you think can be done to counter this?
Well, I think there's an interesting example in a news agency called Engage. It's not quite a news agency, it's a combination of Muslim activists, journalists, people who are interested in fair representation in the media, and they come together, and every time they find a news item which is sensationalist, unfair, inaccurate, they lobby the newspaper or the broadcaster to have some kind of a correction made. This is the way, I think, or one illustration of how Muslim activists and communities themselves are empowered to change the news landscape. And I think that's quite an effective means of approaching this issue. It's a very broad question because there's only so much, I think, that Muslim communities in given nation states can necessarily do. I think Muslims in Britain are perhaps in a better position than Muslims, for example, in France or in Germany. We here have a much more established presence. We're kind of horizontally tied to other communities, other traditions of racial equality. We have a history to draw upon, and we have sympathy and support of political elites. And so we should continue in our conversation to raise these issues, to alert broadcasters and news agencies to discrepancies, and perhaps we can work towards some kind of organic solution to this sense of bias and misrepresentation, rather than simply protesting or there is a stereotype that every time Muslims are misrepresented that they take to the streets with outrageous placards, and I think the kind of dialogical approach might be more effective to countering these sorts of issues.
How do you think that Islamophobia compares with racism in Britain?
Well, I think there are a family of terms. I think that terms such as racism itself needs to be unpacked. And when people talk about racism, they sometimes talk about what we might call biological racism, colour racism. Sometimes people will talk about cultural racism in terms of discrimination, not based upon the colour of somebody's skin, but in terms of where they come from or assumed features about their group's behaviour. I think sometimes when people talk about racism, they're actually talking about anti-Semitism. When sometimes people talk about anti-Semitism, they're also talking about cultural racism. And I think Islamophobia sits in that kind of a nexus. There are kind of these family of terms that draw upon one another, that inevitably overlap, but are sufficiently distinct to actually have their individual identities as terms such as cultural racism, biological racism, anti-Semitism. And I think Islamophobia too has a very specific thing that it should be concerned with, but inevitably it will draw upon this repertoire of terminology and concepts. How does it compare? Well, as I've said before, it's a newer term. It's a much more politically contested term, and there's much less widespread sympathy for the notion of Islamophobia. It's very difficult these days to be openly anti-Semitic. I think it's very easy these days to be openly Islamophobic, and that's something that we should address.
Where do you think the responsibility lies for combating Islamophobia? Do you think it's from the media or the government or from within Muslim communities themselves?
Inevitably a combination. I think Muslim communities, as they have over the last decade, they've become more empowered, they're more vocal, they're more willing to engage and challenge. I think at the same time the government have become more aware of this issue. They haven't necessarily enshrined it in law in the way that anti-Semitism and race is enshrined in law. I'm not even necessarily sure that's the best way to go about it. But it's something that won't be remedied by a single hand. It won't be something that Muslim communities can do on their own. It's not something that the government can do on its own. And even it's not. And the media, to an extent, is by and large responsible for many of these sorts of anxieties. But I don't think the media can resolve this issue alone. It will require a kind of continued effort of different spheres of society. Inevitably, the media being the biggest and most frequent body that articulates a lot of the concerns that Muslims want to object to. For example, misrepresentation, the reduction of very fringe elements to the group as a whole, and so forth. These are things that the media are responsible for. But I don't think simply blaming the media is the best means of resolving the issue. Inevitably, it's an educative process. I mean, the Islamophobia concept received its public policy prominence in about 1997. That's relatively recently. I think as the media become more educated, as I discussed in my paper this evening, they'll have to take these issues more seriously, and then that will have a filtering down effect.
What further research do you think could be done on the subject, either by yourself or others?
Well, I'd be quite interested to learn more about Muslim voices, how Muslims themselves are portrayed in the media, not as objects, but as people who are speaking. So when a news item or a news feature will sometimes refer to a Muslim activist or a Muslim in Bradford or a Muslim elsewhere, they'll sometimes quote what they say. And I'd be quite intrigued to kind of have a typology of those quotes, and so we actually get some kind of spectoral, some kind of pictorial depiction of how Muslims themselves are represented in the media when they're included. Because then we can say to the media that, look, you only ever kind of have people who speak with this kind of a position. Why can't you have Muslims who also speak with that kind of a position? Why are you drawn to this kind of person rather than that kind of person? And that would be some very interesting research.
Okay, well, thank you very much for participating in the interview, and we look forward to your talk this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay.